صباح الخير جميعا. أنا اسمي نديم حوري، نائب المدير التنفيذي لقسم الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا بمنظمة هيومن رايتس ووتش، وعلى يميني زميلي آدم كوغل، باحث في القسم والمسؤول عن متابعة ملف الأردن. شكرا لحضوركم اليوم لهالمؤتمر الصحفي لإطلاق التقرير العالمي عن وضع حقوق الإنسان عام 2013 من قبل منظمة هيومن رايتس ووتش. هيدا التقرير مش مشكلة، لكن شكرا لحضوركم. التقرير السنوي بيغطي أبرز وأهم قضايا حقوق الإنسان بأكثر من 90 بلد بتشتغل فيها منظمة هيومن رايتس ووتش. هو نوع من ملخص لأبرز أحداث العام الماضي. مثل ما بتعرفوا منظمة هيومن رايتس ووتش هي منظمة غير حكومية مستقلة، لا تقبل أي دعم مادي أو غيره من أي جهة حكومية. بالتقرير يلي توزع أكيد في تركيز على عدة مواضيع، بس أبرز القضايا يلي ركزنا عليها بالعام الماضي أكيد موضوع الأزمة والنزاع المسلح اليوم في سوريا، وكنا قد وثقنا انتهاكات جسيمة لقانون حقوق الإنسان والقانون الإنساني الدولي، إن كان من ارتكاب القوات الحكومية انتهاكات جسيمة عبر القصف الجوي، عبر القصف العشوائي، عبر الحصار ومنع وصول الغذاء والمساعدات الإنسانية لمدنيين محاصرين. وهذا موضوع أخيرا عم بيكون تسليط الضوء عليه إعلاميا عبر المفاوضات بجنيف 2، عبر موضوع الاعتقال التعسفي والتعذيب الممنهج في معتقلات السلطات السورية. وكنا قد استطعنا أن نزور عدد من هذه المعتقلات في شمال سوريا بعدما تم السيطرة عليها من بعض القوات المسلحة المعارضة. ولكن أيضا تناولنا انتهاكات جسيمة قامت بها مجموعات مسلحة معارضة للحكومة السورية، ومنها يعني انتهاكات حصلت في شمال اللاذقية، ولكن أيضا بمناطق أخرى منها اعتقال وتعذيب، وأيضا قصف عشوائي على مناطق آهلة بالسكان. يمكن أحد يعني المواضيع التي أيضا ارتكزنا عليها بشكل مكثف هذه السنة هو تراجع ملحوظ في حقوق الإنسان في عدد من البلدان العربية التي دخلت في فترة انتقال في السنوات الثلاثة الماضية. يمكن هنا أبرز مثل هو ما يحصل في مصر اليوم من استعمال مفرط للقوة، حتى القوة المميتة في تفريق المظاهرات والتجمعات، إلى اعتقال معارضين منهم يعني أعضاء في الإخوان المسلمين، ولكن أيضا معارضين آخرين، إلى الوضع يعني منع التجمعات وغيره من الانتهاكات. ولكن أيضا في بلدان أخرى كليبيا، حيث وثقنا عدد من الانتهاكات التي قامت بها مجموعات مسلحة ما يسمى محليا بالميليشيات، من اعتقال وعدم قدرة أو عدم رغبة السلطات الليبية في السيطرة على الوضع، وما يحصل من انتهاكات من جراء ذلك. أو حتى في ليبيا، حيث نرى أن بعد يعني الدخول في فترة الانتقال في السلطة هنالك إفلات من العقاب على شكل واسع لانتهاكات تحصل إن كان من قبل قوات تابعة للحكومة أو مجموعات أخرى. والنقطة الثالثة التي ركزنا عليها في المنطقة هو تراجع في حرية التعبير وحرية التجمع في عدد من البلدان، ومنها بلدان الخليج، يعني إن كان اعتقال ومحاكمة مغردين يعني مستعملي تويتر أو مدونين لفقط يعني التعبير عن رأيهم، إن كان عبر أونلاين بلاتفورمز يعني عبر الإنترنت، أو حتى في نشر المقالات وغيرها. والقمع الذي تعرض إليه عدد من المعارضون السياسيون يعيشون في بلدان الخليج من الإمارات وغيرها. وهذا يعني للأسف ازدادت حدة هذه الملاحقات من اعتقال ومحاكمات حتى في بلدان كانت في الماضي لديها درجة واسعة من حرية التعبير كالكويت وغيره. يعني الملاحقات بسبب أنه قدح وذم الذات الأميرية وغيره من هكذا ملاحقات. التقرير لا يكتفي فقط في تسليط الضوء على البلدان العربية، كما قلت لكم إنه يرتكز على أكثر من 90 بلد. في بلدان الجوار إذا كنا نتحدث عن انتهاكات إسرائيل خاصة فيما يتعلق بالمستوطنات في الضفة والقدس والإفلات من العقاب المستمر لأعمال إجرامية قام بها مستوطنين بالرغم من يعني إحصاء هذه الحالات، وحتى اليوم ليس هنالك أي ملاحقة جدية أو أي عدالة في ظل صمت دولي للأسف أصبحنا اليوم يعني نسمعه سنة بعد سنة. يتناول أيضا التقرير انتهاكات حصلت في الولايات المتحدة حيث مقرنا الرئيسي. هنالك عدة انتهاكات لاحظناها، ربما أبرز 3 انتهاكات في الولايات المتحدة كانت موضوع التنصت هذه السنة، خاصة بعد المعلومات التي صدرت بعدما نشرها السيد سنودن ويعني اكتشاف الكم المهول من المعلومات والانتهاك للخصوصية التي يتم تجميعها من قبل السلطات الأمريكية وعدم موافقة السلطات حتى اليوم من الحد منها وإجلاء الضوء بصورة كاملة. ولكن النقطة الثانية هي حتى اليوم عدم إقفال مركز غوانتانامو، ويعني هذه وصمة العار على الولايات المتحدة. حتى اليوم فشل أوباما بالرغم من عدة وعود بذلك لإقفال هذا المعتقل. وأخيرا وهذا الموضوع يعني يؤثر في المنطقة العربية خاصة في اليمن، موضوع القتل من قبل الدرونز أو الطائرات بلا طيار وعدم المحاسبة للمسؤولين عن ذلك وعدم الشفافية في نشر المعلومات. سأنقل يعني سأحول الآن الكلمة لزميلي آدم كوغل، ولكن أريد أن أختم يعني أنني سعيد جدا أننا نستطيع أن نعمل في الأردن بشكل شفاف وهنالك تعاون من السلطات. نحن عملنا هو الرصد، فمن الطبيعي أن ننتقد، ولكن بنفس الوقت نحن نقدر هذه فسحة العمل وقدرتنا على القيام بهكذا مؤتمر صحفي من دون أي مشاكل مع السلطات. وأملنا أن نستطيع أن نقوم بهكذا مؤتمرات في جميع البلدان العربية لكي يكون حرية التعبير حرية مصونة بشكل حقيقي. ونأمل الخطوة التالية يعني نأمل بتسجيل فرع لمنظمة هيومن رايتس ووتش في الأردن في المستقبل القريب جدا، ونحن الآن في صدد ترجمة يعني الوثائق لكي نقدمها للسلطات بشكل نهائي على أمل أن يكون لدينا فرع دائم في الأردن. والآن سأنقل كلمة لزميلي آدم الذي سيتحدث عن أهم برأينا وأبرز تطورات حقوق الإنسان في الأردن في العام الماضي. شكرا.
Thank you, Nadim. Hello, my name is Adam Kugel, and I'm a Middle East researcher here at Human Rights Watch. Today I'd like to give a brief overview of the human rights situation in Jordan in 2013, both in terms of progress made by Jordan, as well as areas where Jordan continues to fall short of its international obligations. As laid out in the Human Rights Watch Jordan World Report chapter that I think you should all have in front of you, the main areas of focus here will be freedoms of expression and association, refugees, torture and ill treatment, and women's rights. Please keep in mind that the World Report chapter was drafted several months ago, so it may not reflect the most recent developments in particular cases. Also, more areas than I'm going to discuss here are mentioned in the report, so if you have any questions about other issues that I don't talk about, feel free to ask them in the question-answer time. With regards to freedom of expression, In 2013, Jordanian authorities continued to prosecute speech deemed critical of the king, government officials, and institutions, as well as speech considered defamatory of others, including foreign leaders and officials. For example, in October, the State Security Court prosecutor ordered the arrest of 3 Islamist activists for having in their possession posters bearing the word Rab'a in support of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. They charged all 3 with a vague charge harming relations with a foreign state, and one of the 3 with lengthening the tongue, or lèse-majesté, reportedly based on the content of messages he sent using the mobile application WhatsApp. The 3 were held until December 25th, when authorities granted bail. Also in 2013, through a series of appeals, prosecutors continued the 3-year trial of environmental activist Soufiane Tel and journalist Muwafaq Mahaddin on several charges for criticizing Jordan's role in the host bombings in Afghanistan back in 2010. Though the Amman Court of First Instance has exonerated the men two different times, the case remains alive through prosecution appeals. In terms of media freedom, 2013 saw the implementation of a censorship order for over 260 news websites because they refused to comply with 2012 amendments to the Press and Publications Law that require all independent news websites operating within the country to register with the Press and Publications Department, and empower the Director of the Press Department to close down or censor unregistered sites. The amendments also make an electronic publication's owner, editor-in-chief, and director responsible, along with the author, for comments or posts that users place on its website. They also require the editor-in-chief of each news website to have been a member of the Jordan Press Association or Journalist Syndicate for 4 years, although the JPA's bylaws have historically limited its membership to employees of print publications. Late in 2013, many of the blocked websites registered after losing a petition to overturn the censorship order. As such, most of them have disabled comment sections on their websites, eliminating an interactive and unique facet of online publications, fearing legal liability if people were allowed to post. 2013 almost became the first year in recent memory in which we didn't have a high-profile arrest or prosecution of a journalist in Jordan, but unfortunately in September, the State Security Court prosecutor ordered the detention of the publisher and editor-in-chief of the Jafra News website, and eventually charged both of them with harming relations with a foreign state, after their website hosted a third-party YouTube video about the Emir of Qatar's brother. The men were held in detention until December 31st, when an appeals court ordered their release on bail and transferred their case to a regular civilian court. In our view, one of the main reasons that these speech-related prosecutions have continued until now, in spite of numerous reform promises, has been the failure of the government and lawmakers to amend the penal code to bring it into compliance with constitutional free speech guarantees that were strengthened in 2011 when they did constitutional revisions. Rather, prosecutors have continued to use vaguely worded penal code articles that in their application place impermissible restrictions on free expression. Among these are Article 118, harming relations with a foreign state, Article 122, insulting a foreign state, army, flag, national slogan, president, minister, or political representative. Article 132, broadcasting false news outside the kingdom to harm the prestige of the state. Article 150, inciting sectarian or racist strife. Articles 191 and 193, disparaging Parliament, along with other official bodies. And Article 195 itself, which is insulting the king or lèse-majesté. Again, the problem isn't just that these laws remain on the books, but that prosecutors continue to use them to limit free expression in contradiction of Jordan's international human rights obligations. In terms of freedom of assembly, street protests ground to a halt for the most part in 2013, but authorities have continued to prosecute dozens of largely peaceful protesters from 2011 and 2012 protests in the State Security Court under Penal Code Article 149, which is undermining the political regime or inciting opposition to it. On the positive side, it should be noted that the government introduced amendments to the State Security Court law back in September that are intended to end trials of civilians before the court unless they face terrorism, espionage, treason, money counterfeiting, or drug-related charges. These amendments, which I understand will be issued soon, I believe that there was a news item a couple of days ago about the Senate passing a version of the law. The amendments would bring the court into compliance with Article 101 of Jordan's Constitution, which only allows military judges to try civilians for these 5 groups of crimes. However, on the negative side, unfortunately, the Penal Code classifies undermining the political regime as a terrorism crime. And this is the charge faced by the majority of peaceful protesters. So the charges wouldn't really affect those protesters currently on trial. I should also note that based on the charge sheets that Human Rights Watch has reviewed, the typical content of the charge undermining the political regime, it tends to be protest chants and slogans or signs carried in protests that are deemed insulting to particular authorities. If you look at these actual sheets, it's just sort of a laundry list of chants and things like that, and this tends to be the content for that very vague Penal Code article. Many of the protesters on trial in the State Security Court are also facing the charge illegal gathering, in spite of the fact that under the Public Gatherings Law, which was amended in 2011, Jordanians technically no longer require government permission to hold public meetings or demonstrations. As far as we know, there have been very few actual convictions of protesters till now, in spite of lengthy trials. On the subject of refugees, in 2013, the number of Syrian asylum seekers in Jordan rose to well over 550,000 persons, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Of these, approximately 128,000 are currently housed at the Zatari refugee camp in Mafraq, down from well over 200,000 back in April. And 4,000 at least others are at the Emirates Jordan camp in Zarqa. Another large camp for Syrians is currently under construction near Al-Azraq, east of Amman. Now, Jordan indeed deserves a lot of credit for hosting so many refugees, and Human Rights Watch has repeatedly called on countries around the world to support Jordan and other surrounding countries in coping with the presence of so many Syrians. I should also note that based on our research, Syrians have not faced major protection issues inside Jordan, though there are a number of issues of growing concern, including the detention and threatened deportations of Syrians, asylum seekers, and others who have been caught working illegally. And those are issues that we are going to continue looking into in 2014. We should point out, however, that in 2013, the authorities did not permit entry to all those fleeing Syria's conflict. In particular, they have denied entry to Palestinian and Iraqi refugees residing in Syria, single males of military age, and people without documents. Also in late May, the daily number of Syrian refugee arrivals fell abruptly from well over 1,500 per day to about 300 or less. Refugees reported that Jordanian officials had closed the country's border or imposed a strict limit on refugee entries. Jordanian officials denied restrictions and attributed the fall to intense fighting between the Syrian government and opposition forces in the border area, which had impeded refugees' access to the border. But according to humanitarian officials in northern Jordan, as well as refugees, since last Ramadan, Jordan has actually closed all of the western crossings between Jordan and Syria, forcing Syrians to travel east into the desert for several hours until they can make a crossing kind of in an area near to the Iraqi border. This has made it much more difficult for Syrians to come to Jordan, both because of the distance and because of the cost of the trip. Many of them just aren't able to do it. Moving on to the issue of torture and ill treatment very quickly. In spite of the several years of pretty good progress on combating torture and ill treatment in Jordan, accountability for such crimes continues to be lacking. In fact, perpetrators of torture or other ill treatment, they continue to enjoy near total impunity in 2013. Credible allegations of ill treatment were ignored because it remains up to the police, prosecutors, and judges to investigate, prosecute, and try their fellow officers. At the police court, where many such cases are heard, 2 out of the 3 sitting judges are serving police officers appointed by the police. As far as we know, no police or intelligence official has ever been convicted of torture under Article 208 of the Penal Code. But the police court has actually convicted some officers on lesser charges of these types of crimes. I can say that I visited the Public Security Directorate yesterday and asked them for an update, and they couldn't tell me whether or not Article 208 it had been the basis of a conviction in the police court till now. However, in March 2013, a regular public prosecutor, not a police prosecutor, and actually took it upon himself to investigate the death in custody of Sultan al-Khatatba, whom authorities had arrested in Jerish on a drug possession charge earlier that month. The prosecutor recommended actually that 6 public security directorate officers should face torture charges under Article 208 of the Penal Code, which is the first such recommendation that we know of in the history of Jordan. Judicial authorities, however, transferred the case to the police court, where the trial is still ongoing. And I did ask the police spokesman for an update on this case yesterday, and he said it was still being tried, so we don't have a result on that yet. If they do end up convicting or prosecuting these officers based on Article 208, I think it'll be a good step forward. But obviously, Jordan still has a long way to go on the impunity for torture issue. On women's rights, Human Rights Watch actually, we welcomed the recent announcement of an agreement between a group of parliamentarians and the government to grant civil status to to Jordanian women married to non-citizen husbands. This would greatly improve their access to education and healthcare and remove a lot of the hassles around renewing their residency status every year. The proposed law, which I understand isn't actually drafted yet, but the proposed idea behind the law has the potential to impact hundreds of thousands of children in Jordan, and we encourage lawmakers to draft it and pass it as soon as possible. We believe, however, that this initiative should be merely a first step towards ending all legal discrimination against women in Jordan. Specifically, Jordan should remove its reservations to the Convention on Ending all Discrimination Against Women and allow women to pass on their nationality to their children as men can. Finally, I'd like to talk briefly about the initial results of Jordan's Universal Periodic Review session at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva last October. For those who don't know, the UPR, or Universal Periodic Review, is a comprehensive review of a state's human rights record by other UN member states and takes place every 4 years. In October, Jordan faced a mixture of praise and criticism by other countries, as well as a host of recommendations. Recommendations of note included bringing all domestic legislation, including the Penal Code, into line with international human rights agreements signed by Jordan, as well as removing all restrictions on the media and rescinding provisions of the press law that impinge on media freedom, limiting the jurisdiction of the State Security Court, all of which Jordan indicated that it will accept. Unfortunately, Jordan indicated it will reject a number of other important recommendations. Among these are removing jurisdiction of crimes of torture or ill treatment from the police court and transferring jurisdiction for these crimes to regular courts, removing its reservations to CEDAW, and that specifically is women not being allowed to pass on their nationality to children, as well as abolishing the death penalty or establishing a moratorium on use of the death penalty. And the last one I want to mention is revising Article 149 of the Penal Code so that it cannot be used against political activists. Jordan actually rejected this recommendation. I believe it was made by the United Kingdom. Jordan will give a final response to recommendations in a couple of months, and we definitely urge authorities to reconsider and accept these latter recommendations I just mentioned. Finally, I think it's important for me here now to give a few recommendations of our own, which would immediately improve Jordan's human rights record in 2014 and help fulfill critical aspects of King Abdullah's comprehensive reform program. These would include, as mentioned before, undertaking urgent and critical penal code reform to amend or eliminate altogether vague provisions used to limit basic freedoms. And I listed out those a few minutes ago. Remove provisions of the Press and Publications Law and the Law of Information System crimes, which threaten freedom of expression and which treat libel and slander as criminal and, in fact, jailable offenses. Jordan should also drop charges against persons facing prosecution or imprisoned for peaceful exercise of their rights to free expression, association, or assembly, including peaceful protesters on trial before the State Security Court. Jordan should remove jurisdiction over criminal matters involving police and prison abuse from the police court and transfer it to regular courts. And finally, Jordan should pass the law, the proposal to grant civil status to children of Jordanian women, and eventually allow women to pass on their nationality. As I said, we did discuss quite a few other issues in the World Report chapter itself, so feel free to read it. But that's all I have to present today, and I guess we can now open it up for questions.
On Jordan or in other countries as well.
Yeah, we'll also take questions on other countries if you have them.
صباح الخير، أنا إياد خليفة من موقع البوابة الإلكتروني. أستاذ، في تقارير انتهاكات التي تجري في سوريا في مخيم اليرموك وعدة مناطق أخرى، هل تم توثيقها من أجل تقديمها إلى محاكم الجرائم الدولية في لاهاي؟ بالنسبة للوضع في الأردن، هل هناك أي اجتماعات أو لقاءات مع الحكومة الأردنية أو خبراء أو مختصين من أجل تحسين بعض القوانين بما يتناسب مع ما تتعهد فيه الحكومة الأردنية مع المجتمع الدولي؟ شكرا.
بما يتعلق الوضع المأساوي بمخيم اليرموك، احنا كنا أصدرنا بالماضي يعني بيان وثق الحالة المأساوية ومنع وصول المساعدات للمخيم ولمناطق أخرى في سوريا كالغوطة الشرقية ويعني مناطق أخرى تم توثيقها. وكنا أرسلنا عدة رسائل إلى الأخضر الإبراهيمي المسؤول عن المفاوضات وغيرها عن تكون ذلك أولوية في أي مفاوضات في جنيف 2 السماح لدخول هكذا مساعدات. وطلبنا بإحالة الملف، ونحن نطالب ذلك صراحة من أكثر من 2.5 سنين، إحالة ملف سوريا إلى محكمة الجنايات الدولية لكي يتم ملاحقة أي جريمة، إن كانت العقاب الجماعي الذي هو يفرض على مدنيين في مخيم اليرموك ومناطق أخرى، ولكن أيضا جرائم أخرى كالتعذيب الممنهج، قصف العشوائي وغيرها. للأسف يعني اليوم يجب أن نعترف أن هنالك إخفاق حقيقي للمجتمع الدولي فيما يخص سوريا. يعني بعد 3 سنين أكثر من 100,000 قتيل، أكثر من 6 ملايين أشخاص يعني أجبروا على مغادرة منازلهم، حتى اليوم لا نرى تفاعل حقيقي من قبل المجتمع الدولي. اليوم ننتظر لنرى إن كانت المبادرة في جنيف 2 عبر إدخال المساعدات الإنسانية لحمص تتحول إلى لنقول مبادرة أكبر على مستوى كافة الأراضي السورية. هذا هو المطلوب. يعني نحن برأينا الآن مطلوب تحول جذري في الوضع في سوريا، ليس فقط إدخال مثلا بعض السلع كما حصل في اليرموك من حوالي أسبوع، يعني يدخل سمح للأونروا بإدخال بعض المساعدات ولكن على مدة 2 يوم، ولكن بعد ذلك أقفل هذا الباب بوجه الأونروا من قبل السلطات السورية. هذا الموضوع اليوم مرفوض. نحن نأمل أن يكون هنالك ضغط حقيقي على المستوى الدولي من قبل مجلس الأمن للسماح بدخول المساعدات الإنسانية. منذ حوالي 3 أشهر كان هنالك ما يسمى presidential statement، يعني إعلان رئاسي من مجلس الأمن بموضوع المساعدات الإنسانية في سوريا، ولكن لم يتم ترجمة هذا الإعلان اللي هو إعلان نوايا لأن ليس لديه قدرة تنفيذ بأي عمل حقيقي صراحة. يعني نحن اليوم بانتظار، ولكن نعرف أن كل يوم انتظار. قد يكون هنالك أشخاص يموتون لأنهم لا يستطيعون أن يحصلوا إلى الكمية الكافية من الطعام أو إلى العلاج الطبي المرجو منه. بما يخص الأردن يعني سأترك الكلمة لزميلي آدم، ولكن هنالك يعني واضح عدة توصيات نقدمها للسلطات الأردنية لكي تتوافق مع المعايير الدولية ومع ما هي يعني قالت في المحافل الدولية أنها ستحاول أن تتلازم معها. بس آدم أنا في basically if we have recommendation what Jordan is doing in terms of complying with its international obligations. Just briefly.
Yeah, well, I mean, Jordan is a signatory to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as the Convention Against Torture, as well as the Arab Charter on Human Rights, and many other important agreements. Jordan actually is a signatory to most of them, excluding the refugee conventions, but most of them Jordan has signed. So it has taken upon itself a number of really important human rights obligations. Among these are allowing free expression, association, assembly. Jordan also, I think, where the areas I can just say where it's really lacking are legislation such as the press law and the penal code articles that directly criminalize peaceful speech. The use of the penal code article that criminalizes illegal gathering, despite the fact that public gatherings in Jordan should be permitted without government approval, only government notification. It is making some progress, I suppose, in fulfilling its obligations under the Convention Against Torture. There are quite a number of high-profile programs that are going on to try to eliminate these practices in Jordan, but they need to basically take the final step, which is accountability for such crimes. When these crimes are alleged to have happened, they need to conduct credible investigations and serious prosecutions of anybody involved. And it's only when there is accountability for such crimes that there's a real incentive for these officers and others to think twice about actually engaging in this kind of behavior. If they know that they're not going to be prosecuted, then it's sort of a green light to continue some of these acts, even if Jordan has, in other areas such as inside prisons, eliminated a lot of the more systematic practices that used to go on many years ago. Can you introduce yourself?
My name is Rima Al-Masri from Hiber.com. My question is about the good news when it comes to state security law. I think there is a bit of a misleading kind of rhetoric from the state for the amendments itself, although civilians are still not tried. Civilians are still not tried under military judges, but they're still tried under civilian judges in a state security law. So the amendments did not really exclude civilians from being tried in a state security law, which is still problematic and violates human rights. Also, there are 3 different points where the amendment still violates human rights. One of it is that it's not a public trial. The state security law usually, state security courts are usually closed. And while the state security judges can be civilians, the public persecution is still military too. And then the state security law violates one of the most important criterion of a fair trial, which is also that judges are also appointed by the government's prime minister, and the martial judges appointed by the chairman of Joint of Chief, which also creates a conflict of interest when it comes to a fair trial.
Yes, and I think most of is actually included in our report chapter or in other publications that we have released on Jordan. You're right in saying that other than a group of civilian judges, I think there are around 6. The State Security Court is essentially a military institution. The president of the court is a military officer. Some of the judges are military officers, obviously. The public prosecution office inside the State Security Court is entirely consists of military officers. So there obviously is a major problem. In terms of all of the trials of civilians that are going on in the State Security Court. In terms of transparency and access, I can say that I think to some extent that may be improving. what authorities have done traditionally is they've kind of tended to restrict the entry to people who are direct family members of the persons on trial, or others who can sort of prove that they need to be there for whatever reasons, sort of citing space concerns. But I can say, for example, that I've been able to attend all 3 trial sessions in the Abu Qatada trial so far, and I haven't had any trouble getting in. And I've also attended other trial sessions. So this aspect may be improving, which is a really positive development. In terms of the proposed amendments, I think the major issue, there's 2 major issues really. I think number one, they said that the law, once passed, it wouldn't be retroactive. It wouldn't apply to cases that are already being heard before the court. So you have dozens and dozens of these trials going on in which protesters or others may or may not be facing charges that now would not be under the state security court's jurisdiction, but the trials are ongoing because it's not retroactive. At least that's what the government has announced. The second thing is the inclusion under the terrorism section of the Penal Code, Article 149, which is taqweed an nidam al-hukm, or undermining the political regime. It's a very broad and vague charge, and in practice, authorities actually use it to criminalize, in fact, insulting the king or insulting officials for the most part. And this, as a terrorism provision, would allow prosecutors to bring lots of civilians up for trial before the state security court. In effect, I mean, since they can use these charges, this particular charge, I should say, in a number of different cases, I think if that actually goes on, there won't be a huge change on the ground from what we're seeing now with the state security court, unfortunately. And we've called on authorities repeatedly during the drafting process to make sure that penal code reform accompanies the state security court law reform, but so far I haven't heard any major initiatives on that front.
صباح الخير. اسمي محمد الدامي، مراسل الشرق الأوسط. سيدي، بالنسبة للتقرير هذا، عندما تراجعوا المسؤولين الأردنيين، ماذا يكون رد المسؤول الأردني على هذا التقرير؟ إذا في مجال تطلعنا شو بيكون ردهم أو شو تبريرهم لهذا الموضوع؟ شكرا.
I mean, you hear different things. I would say that the main thing that officials here will discuss is the reform program and the efforts that the authorities are making to fix some of these problems. So they'll spend a lot of time, talking about their desire to change the law. I mean, a perfect example is the press and publications law. After the censorship order back in July, I actually participated in a delegation consisting of Article 19, as well as the International Press Institute in Vienna. And we did meetings with the Prime Minister, with members of Parliament, with the Senate, with the lower Majlis Nawab, as well as other officials from the Royal Court and other places. And all of them said that the law was problematic. The amendments, at least on the news websites, all of them admitted that there were major issues that needed to be fixed. But unfortunately, nobody actually wanted to take responsibility for fixing them. Nobody wanted to say, okay, the government, basically what you'd have is the lower house would say, the Prime Minister and the government, they need to introduce a change, whereas the Prime Minister told us that the lower house needs to introduce the legislation. So, it's sort of a bit of a cat and mouse game. The other thing, for example, the vague penal code articles, meetings last year I did with the Ministry of Justice. The typical argument they would use is that we have to enforce the law. We don't like, if you don't like these laws, go talk to Parliament. But all we're doing on the ground is enforcing the laws that exist in Jordan, which I think is a little bit disingenuous because the laws are so vague that they can be interpreted in a number of ways, and prosecutors tend to use them in somewhat politicized ways that definitely constitute violations of free expression, free assembly, and free association at times.
Thank you very much. Joris, Embassy of Belgium. First of all, Thanks to both of you and to Human Rights Watch for the excellent report and the good work you're doing. Question on Jordan specifically. When it comes to the region, the events in the region were tied to what we call the Arab Spring, or what happened in different countries. What I hear from you is very factual. What's going forward, what's not going forward, what is possible. I would like to take it one step further and ask you if you have an idea of the whys on the different subjects that you talk about. Why is there willingness and possibility to move forward in Jordan, and why on others is there not? Is it related to the events in the region? Is it related to things within the society of Jordan? Is it related to reluctance somewhere on a political level? So what are the reasons for progress or for lack of progress?
Look, I think there are a number of things. Obviously, in terms of pressures that would impede progress on human rights issues, the security situation in the region is really quite difficult, and I think that there's a fear on the part of authorities that, if they lose some of their powers to control, the citizens' rights in a number of areas, that things could maybe get out of control. You hear that argument actually explicitly sometimes from government officials. That being said, I think that the regional security fears are counterbalanced by the reform promises that the king and the government have committed themselves to. They have come out and said that Jordan, they want to, introduce, bring all domestic, for example, legislation into compliance with the new constitution, which has pretty good human rights provisions. And they pledged to do that. They pledged to honor, obviously, all of their international agreements. And, there is sort of slow progress on, some of these fronts. There have been initiatives, there have been steps forward. In many cases, they haven't gone all the way, right? So they need to continue to make progress. That being said, I think it's difficult for us to pin down very specifically, why certain individuals would push forward with reform or why they wouldn't. But I think that in a general sense, you have basically this competing issue in Jordan between the security situation and the reform promises.
If I can just come in with a sort of try to extrapolate a bit more for your question in terms of regional dynamics and also the role of the international community and Western diplomats particularly. For years, the excuse we would hear in Amman, but also in Abu Dhabi, in Kuwait, in Morocco, is we cannot make reforms because if we make reforms, it will lead to more instability and so forth. And I think this idea that somehow the only way to have stability is to have a form of repression that can go from a very sort of brutal Ba'athist-style repression in Syria to sort of the softer king-style repression, Jordan and Morocco went through in past years. Frankly, that sort of equation has been proven to be wrong. If anything, the Arab uprising showed that these countries were not stable, and that underneath that sort of surface was sort of boiling societies that have many, many legitimate concerns. And so the discourse started changing 2-3 years ago, and we started seeing many countries at different levels, some saying we have to introduce reforms to stay ahead of that curve, and others saying, particularly in the Gulf countries, we need to shut down because we don't want this to come to our countries. And we saw rollbacks, for example, in countries like the United Arab Emirates, dramatic rollbacks, and even in countries like Oman, we started seeing arrests increasing. Now, today, interestingly, because of the increased instability in countries like Syria, like Libya, like Yemen, we're starting to hear that discourse of, whoa, let's slow down. You hear it from officials in many different capitals of sort of saying we have to control things so things don't lose control. And this is sort of the discourse now that's dominant in Egypt. And it's even more dangerous because it's now assuming some form of populist appeal to it. Our view is that this is actually a dangerous rollback and it's not going to give stability. I think that the real challenge now is to ensure that also Western countries don't fall back into that old paradigm. I mean, that paradigm was applied for 40 years, and where did it get us? In our view, I think it would be foolish to go back to that old paradigm. I think you need to push on with reforms. When we talk about international obligations and international treaties, these are not electives. I mean, countries have decided to sign on. It's like when you sign a contract, you oblige yourself to comply with that contract. No one forced them to, and we're happy they signed on to these obligations. And now when they make reforms, when they amend the Constitution, that's not just حسن good intentions. These are supposed to be legally binding documents. So the challenge is now for these authorities to comply with it. So I think, I think all of us need to sort of push back, because we hear it. We hear it in many different places. We have to slow down now. But I have yet to see one country where reforms have led to more instability, real reforms.
Hi, my name is Rubal Ibrahim, activist. So, if we're going to evaluate the human rights situation in Jordan in 2013, can we say it was backward or forward? And I want a straight answer.
To be honest with you, I don't think there have been some small steps forward, but I think in general it's been fairly the same. There was a lot of hope back in 2011 that the reform program would lead to very, very real, tangible changes on the ground. There have been, I think I mentioned a few areas that have improved, but over the last year, for the most part, things have stayed, I think, pretty much the same.
في أي سؤال بعد? Any more questions? Okay.
Did you mention the office?
Yeah, I went over at the beginning, yeah. Okay. شكرا جميعا لحضوركم، وإذا في أي سؤال احنا حنكون هون إذا بتحبوا تكفوا النقاش. شكرا لحضوركم وللإعلام، وآملين إنه السنة الجاية بنكون صرنا مسجلين بالأردن كفرع لجمعية دولية.